This project has been generously funded by the Leverhulme Trust, for which I'm very grateful. It's part of a larger project called Measuring Medieval Users' Responses to Manuscripts, New Technological Approaches. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Rudy. I'm professor of art history at the University of St. Andrews, and I work on manuscripts and old books. And in particular, I'm interested in developing tools for understanding how people used and interacted with their books, where they took them, what emotions they had around them. And I'm working on a 3-year Leverhulme project with my colleague and friend and fantastic pollen specialist, Eileen Tisdall. Do you want to say a few words about yourself, Eileen?
Hi, my name is Dr. Eileen Tisdall. I'm a lecturer in environmental geography at the University of Stirling.
So ultimately, we would like to use the pollen record in manuscripts, that is, the pollen trapped in the pages and the gutters and the bindings of medieval manuscripts, because it should show us where manuscripts have traveled. So this manuscript, Dean Brown's prayer book, for example, was made in the southern Netherlands, but then brought to Scotland, and it should contain pollen from both places. Now, that's ultimately what we're going to work up to. At the moment, we are still in the testing phases to ascertain whether the environment in books is actually salubrious for preserving pollen over a long period of time. So that's what we're setting out to do.
So for me, for pollen, it's normally something that's really ancient, and I would look in peat bogs, I would look in lakes, I would look in these places that haven't changed much over time, and I wouldn't really look at anything this modern, so or in a book. So this is completely new and completely different for me, but I have to say it's been an amazing journey so far, and I've learned so much.
Fabulous. So over the course of the lockdown, you have built some apparatus in order to begin testing the pollen in manuscripts, which is our joint project, which we're talking about today. Can you say a few words about the pollen hoover?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because we had to kind of think about how would you lift the pollen off the pages of a book without damaging the book, and then still being able to kind of capture the pollen. So we borrowed from a lot of the forensic pollen people, but their equipment is very expensive, so we had to go for something slightly more creative. And so we just adapted a handheld hoover with a special filter on the end of it. So the filter is normally used in environmental science for filtered water, so testing for bacteria. So I could put in a filter paper that would be small enough to trap the pollen. So that's what we kind of used. And then the next step was to actually use it on some books. But by the time we got to that step, we were most definitely in lockdown. So I had to fall back on books that I had in my own house.
Eileen, so what was the book you hoovered over lockdown?
It was a guide to the Pyrenees. So it's a travel book, but it's quite specific because we only used it when we knew we were going on a walk or a hike. So we would open the page that was relevant to where we were. So that's why we're quite confident it was actually only ever opened when we were out in the Pyrenees, because that's when we used the sort of maps and the descriptions of the walks when we were there.
So you wouldn't obviously need a guide to the Pyrenees while traipsing around Scotland. So the pollen that's trapped in that particular book is likely to have been deposited while you were using it, and you had it outside, opened it,
yes,
and then clapped it shut, trapping inside. But that's fantastic. So could you tell us a bit about what exactly pollen is before we go any further?
So all flowering plants produce pollen, and it's part of their reproductive cycles. Different plants produce different amounts and different types of pollen, and at different times of the year. As I say, so it's all part of the plants flowering and then producing seed. And to do that, they need to produce pollen. Mm-hmm. So pollen in itself is actually really interesting material. It's actually really robust. It is a very tough outer coat. And so it can survive quite long amounts of time in the atmosphere, because that's important, as pollen. Pollen is either moved through the air or on insects to go from plant to plant. So it's got a very robust sort of outer coat on it, but then that's really useful in terms of, because then it preserves beautifully. So if you get the right conditions, pollen will preserve for millions of years. So it's quite impressive substance. But mostly, most pollen you would look for would be maybe 50 to 60,000 years. It preserves in really sort of best in environments where there's no oxygen. So most people, as I say, look in peat bogs or lake sediments for pollen, but it will preserve in really strange environments. So really arid environments are really well known for pollen as well. So as I say, an early interesting kind of substance. And I think we're going to push that very slightly to the limit in this project to work out. So these books aren't, as I say, normal environments where you would hunt for pollen, but so far it's been a real eye-opener for me.
So how do you know where the pollen comes from when you find a grain of pollen on something or in a bog or in a book or wherever it is? How do you know what the species is and where it might have come from?
So this relies on lots of other people doing a huge amount of work over sort of the centuries that pollen has been used as a way in which to work out what environments, what vegetation was growing at a particular time. So lots and lots of research has gone into sort of collecting plants and then looking at the pollen that the different plant species produce, and then just basically building up a catalogue of the different plants and keying them out. So roots in botany and identifying plants. So they've set up keys then for pollen. And some pollen types are really, really distinctive. So, so tree pollen, for example, is quite different to pollen that maybe has been moved by insects.
Could you show the 3D models that you have?
I can, yeah, how about that?
Okay. I do love these. And I appreciate that there is a person out there who specializes in printing out 3D models of pollen, and that you are the consumer of these.
I am, yes, yeah. Some amazing 3D pollen project has been scanning the pollen grains to generate the models then that you can then print in 3D in plastic. So these pollen grains, so this one.
That's fantastic.
It's a pine pollen. So you can see this pollen grain travels through the air and it's got these two sacs that make it much lighter, and so it can travel really long distances, so thousands of kilometers pine pollen can travel. So pine pollen is actually, because it's so big, you quite often can see it. So if you go out in your car and you're parked near some pine trees, then you'll see the pollen on the top of the car. And also you see it in lakes as well. If it's a really good year for pine pollen, it'll be coated on the surface of the lake. So it's quite a visible one. But trees mostly produce lots and lots of pollen, and it's sometimes either really designed to go through the air or very small to travel through the air. So then flowering plants, which need insects to move their pollen about, have slightly different structures. So this pollen here looks quite spiky. So it looks like it would be really sticky. So this is like from the group of plants like dandelions. And so here the pollen sticks together more, or sticks to the insect a little bit more, and so then it gets moved from plant to plant in that way.
Fascinating. Wow. So in the travel guide to the Pyrenees, what did you find? What kind of a pollen grain did you find?
So we found a pine pollen in the travel guide. It was very exciting because you do get pine species in the Pyrenees. So one of the tiny drawbacks about pollen is that it sometimes is quite difficult to tell the difference in sort of species between the different pollen types. So some species produce really distinctive pollen types, and other species produce a pollen type that you can't tell the difference between the different species. So pine is one of those. So you know it's come from a pine tree, but you don't know which species of pine.
So the pollen grain you found was from a pine tree, and that pine tree can be found in the Pyrenees, but it could be found other places as well. So it's not, it's slightly limiting the geographic area where that tree could have come from, but it's not completely limiting it.
No, so this is where you have to put together the kind of the understanding of what you have, so the actual taxonomy of the species, and then the taphonomy, which is how that pollen grain actually got to be in your place. So I need to think about the book. So how does pollen get to a book? So that's the difficult bit. So normally I don't need to think about that too much because I'm looking in lakes and peat bogs where I can have a pretty good understanding of how the pollen has landed in that particular place. But the book presents a slightly different challenge for me. So when we looked at the travel guide, that was quite good because I thought, okay, we had quite a high level confidence that we didn't open that book when we were in Scotland. We just opened the book when we were in the Pyrenees. And so I can have a slightly better kind of, say for better sort of certainty that actually I think this pine pollen grain has come from the Pyrenees.
We were beginning to answer the question, can books trap pollen, preserve it, and provide clues about where the books were used? With the travel guide to the Pyrenees, we were that much closer to demonstrating that this could be the case. The next step was to try the technique on some older books, ones that were highly likely to contain pollen. They would provide a test environment to answer the next question. Can pollen survive in a book for several hundred years? To tackle that question, we enlisted the help of Bob McLean at the University of Glasgow Library. He suggested a number of books that were likely to contain pollen so that we could begin testing the process on actual special collections items. These books included one titled Flowers Plucked in Those Holy Fields, arranged by the Reverend Arthur Hastings Kelk, and this was produced in Jerusalem by the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews. That's a separate topic altogether. But the important thing is that the book was made about 1900, and as you can see, it contains actual samples of plant material. And secondly, this book, also from about 1900, which is a souvenir volume of flowers and views of the Holy Land, consisting of 12 chromolithographs depicting various places in the Holy Land, that has pressed flowers from each of these places mounted onto the facing plate. And you'll see here that there are guard sheets, the tissues between the pages in order to try to protect and consolidate the samples. So this book too should contain pollen from the plants pressed between its folios. And the question now was whether that pollen could be extracted safely and whether the book had preserved the pollen grains sufficiently so that they could be identified. To ensure that our practices were safe for the rare books and to help develop the technique, we worked with Ciara McKee, book conservator at the University of Glasgow Library.
I had a moment where I thought, well, maybe we could put a protective sort of screen or mesh over the flower samples and vacuum lightly through that. But I think there's too much risk to the samples from abrasion and catching them. And if it were to slide or move, I think it's then quite a catching surface. So moved away from that idea pretty quickly.
Just edges and then, or in the middle of the book.
There's in the middle of the book, and I've noticed on a few of these like tissue guards, like down underneath them, there's quite a lot of dust, and in some cases little bits of debris from the plant themselves. And I spoke to Julie about that, that if little bits of these seed heads or plant things have kind of come away from the sample anyway and fallen into the gutter, she's happy to regard that as part of the sample that you collect today. If little bits of the dried thing that have already fallen off come up in the hoover, then that could be regarded as part of the sample, because it's not a loss of information to the book. We wouldn't reinstate that into the sample at any point, so you might find that there's bits of pollen clinging onto those bits. I don't know. So there's some little particles just around here that are lifting onto the brush. I don't know if that's just dust or... Oh, there goes a bit. Okay.
So it looks like one flower on top of another one, or petals from another flower.
Oh yeah.
To me.
Oh.
So what kinds of debris would be on a weasel brush?
I don't know.
Weasel
Yeah.
cooties.
That's the scientific term, is it? Weasel. Sounds like a name of a book.
I think this was from the Trinity College.
TCL 14138.
Trinity College.
So this was in this case it was the training college for the
the
Church
training
of
college.
Scotland here.
Right.
Yeah, so it became part of the Church of
I
Scotland.
see now, like they're named.
So you can get more specific
Yeah,
information here.
definitely.
I love how it's set up to look like a prayer book
Yeah,
in a way.
I suppose
It's
this is a souvenir to think back
Yeah.
when
Oh,
you're
there.
your
Cyclamen,
time.
anise.
Are they the sorts of things you'd be looking at, or is
Yeah,
that?
because see,
Yeah.
that's a nice.
Yeah.
And also, when you get to these plants, which have these more open florets, they want to distribute the pollen really widely. So they're relying on insects, but masses of pollen, and so actually it's much easier for that pollen to get released from the flower.
Yep. And so just do the same thing, just kind of run around over the.
Yeah.
I think there's little black specks around it on there, but I don't know if that's just because you can see there's quite a lot of soot
Yeah.
on this book.
Oh,
So I wouldn't be surprised if that's some of what you find
Right, okay.
settling on them, because you see the undulations and the
Yeah,
fact
yeah.
the gaps,
Yeah.
and the soot's been gathering in those. So soot's obviously come down through the head of the text box, so it might be kind of sitting on the. So I wouldn't be surprised if you find quite a bit of that.
All right.
So the filter.
And so, Eileen, so when you brought the samples from that day in Glasgow back to your lab in Stirling, what did you find was in that dust?
So it was quite interesting because we had two books to hoover. So one of the books just contained sort of arrangement of flowers from the Holy Land, and the other book actually had samples of pressed flowers sort of from the Holy Land. So there were slightly different books, and the book that actually gave the best results was the book that contained the actual flower samples themselves. And these were flowers that were quite open. They had lots of different sort of individual florets on them, so they were quite a polliniferous plant species to begin with. So it was kind of the best shot we were going to have to find the pollen, and we did find the pollen of that particular plant in the filter. So what this kind of gave me a lot of hope for was that the pollen survived in those conditions for that length of time, and it was identifiable. Yeah. That was the key. So sometimes you see pollen, you see fragments of it, but you can't identify it. But here, the actual kind of, the plant was identifiable as a plant, as that species. So it was I think it's called Madonna flower, I think was the one, and it's Apiaceae, which is like a carrot, the wild carrot type family. And there was pollen that's really distinctive of that particular family. So, and really nicely preserved as well, which was fantastic. So that was the real surprise.
Now that we have found well-preserved pollen grains in 120-year-old books, the next step in developing our proof of concept will be to examine the residue in books that are likely to have been taken outside, but don't have pressed flowers in them. And for this, it will be instructive to look at some travel books like the Baedeker's Guide, which were printed in Germany as of 1827. And there are lots of copies of them around libraries across Europe. And so that will be a useful kind of inroad into further developing this proof of concept. Now, ultimately, as a manuscript historian, I would like to know more about how people traveled with their books and whether they use their books outside. And to answer that question, I would like to look specifically at a few manuscripts that have water damage that suggests that they were used in an open way and carried outside, for example, in the rain. And so one of those is a manuscript with instructions for taking a procession. The opening at the incipit for that text for taking a procession has been water damaged, and you can see that the red ink has reconstituted and has run across the page a bit. And so is that a manuscript that has trapped pollen when it was open outside and being used in a procession, quite possibly in the springtime for this Easter procession? And can we find any pollen in that book as a result of its presumed use in that form? Now, a second example of a manuscript that was most likely open outside is a book of hours that has this Vigil of the Dead, that where the pages have become crumpled because they were wetted, quite possibly with rainwater, again used outside, and then they dried, and when they dried, they shrunk somewhat. And I wonder whether this manuscript was used by somebody who was mourning the loss of a loved one at a gravesite and reading the Vigil of the Dead on behalf of the recently deceased person. And so this would be interesting if we could see further evidence that books were used in this way outside at the gravesite. Now, finally, for me, one of the most important questions concerns medieval manuscripts used as guides to pilgrimage. And in particular, I'm thinking about one made in the southern Netherlands around 1500. It's a book of hours with extra texts to be said at sites around Jerusalem where there were important shrines. And you can see in this opening that the owner, whose name may have been Jan de Tromp, who was a bailiff in Ostende, did he actually take this book with him from the Netherlands to Jerusalem and use it at the various shrines where he's depicted in the site of the baptism at the Jordan River? Or was this manuscript and others like it, were they used as guides to armchair pilgrimage and not actually intended to be taken on physical journeys? And so we hope to test a number of these books. And we also hope that listeners will suggest other books, manuscripts, early printed books, etc., that are likely to have traveled and for which pollen analysis can help illuminate aspects of their reception. At the Scottish-based team, that is Eileen, Tisdall, Kira McKee, Bob McLean, if he wants to come, and I are more than happy to travel anywhere to libraries and private collections to take samples to see if we can determine by investigating this pollen record where those books traveled. So please do get in touch.